Hello. So today's video will explore climate inaction and the psychological barriers that keep us individuals from acting, despite knowing that climate change is real. Businesses and governments may seem like the most important aspects when it comes to combating climate change. However, individuals and their behavioral choices still play a significant role. Hopefully this video will give you better insight into your own environmental actions and perhaps even inspire some change. Let's begin with some stats about global perceptions on climate change. The following statistics are from a study by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication about international public opinion on climate change. Some places such as Russia and China were not included in the study. So, majority of respondents in all surveyed areas think climate change is happening. Majority of respondents in nearly every area surveyed said they were very or somewhat worried about climate change. Respondents in nearly every area think climate change is a threat to their country or territory over the next 20 years. The global concern for climate change is undeniable. The survey shows that the majority of people recognize it as a major threat. However, when we look at real-world action, the picture becomes less promising. So, relatively few respondents expressed a willingness to join an organized group for climate action. 69% of the global population expressed a willingness to contribute 1% of their personal income to combat climate change. 51% of Americans believe they're doing the right amount to combat climate change, while 43% feel they're still doing too little. We've seen that despite high awareness, many people don't take meaningful action to climate change. But why does this gap exist? Psychological research points to several key barriers that make action difficult. The first barrier I will talk about is social identity theory. Our social groups strongly influence our attitudes and actions. Social identity theory tells us that we tend to align our beliefs with those of the group we identify with. If you're a part of a community or political group that is skeptical about climate change, you might suppress your own environmental concerns to avoid conflict or to fit in. A systematic review of climate change in social psychology publications by Tam et al. 2021 found that social dynamics underlie human responses to climate change. They also found that people are more likely to follow climate-related group norms if they strongly identify with the group. A study by Ull et al. 2018 found that climate change information can feel overwhelming and threatening. When people experience this kind of threat, it may trigger emotional responses where they focus on defending their way of life or group identity instead of considering practical steps to reduce climate change. Barth et al. 2018 noted that when people feel threatened by climate change, they tend to conform more strongly to the norms of their own group. This might include adhering to certain beliefs or behaviors that the group considers important. This conformity is a way of gaining a sense of control or reassurance during times of perceived crisis. The second barrier is cognitive dissonance. This describes the mental discomfort we feel when our beliefs and behaviors don't line up. Rather than changing our behavior, we adjust our beliefs to reduce that discomfort. For example, someone believing that air travel contributes to climate change, but frequently takes flights for holidays or work. They downplay their personal impact or focus on unrelated pro-environmental behaviors they do to offset guilt. Another example may be someone believing in ethical shopping but frequently purchasing from cheap, unsustainable fast fashion stores. These are examples of justifying inaction despite knowing better. Some other examples include doubting climate science, arguing that one's personal efforts are too insignificant, or blaming others, such as governments or businesses. A study by Stoll-Kleeman et al. 2001 explores the psychological barriers that prevent Swiss citizens from committing to climate change mitigation measures, despite awareness of the issues. Participants interviewed through focus groups recognized that climate change is a serious issue, but were reluctant to change their behaviors. The study identified several ways participants adjusted beliefs to reduce discomfort, such as resisting change because shifting away from comfortable lifestyles would be too expensive, believing that individual efforts are too insignificant, and a reliance on technological solutions to address climate change. The final barrier I will talk about is psychological distance. This is the idea that if an issue feels far away, either geographically or socially, we are less likely to feel compelled to act. For example, people in developed countries may perceive climate change as a distant issue because its most severe impacts are seen in less developed or remote areas, such as the Arctic or Pacific Islands. Further, people perceive climate change as something that will affect future generations, not their own, resulting in less urgency to act. Also, if people perceive climate change as unlikely or uncertain, they may be less motivated to act. These kinds of things make climate change seem abstract. By framing climate change as a distant issue, we reduce the immediacy of the situation. Research, including studies by Mayella et al. 2020 and Van Valkengode et al. 2023, show that when issues feel concrete and immediate, people are more willing to engage in pro-environmental behaviours. Given these barriers, what can be done? Fortunately, research points to several strategies that might help shift the balance from inaction to action. One strategy is reducing the psychological distance of climate change. This means bringing the issue closer to home. Local governments can do this by highlighting local effects of climate change. For example, instead of focusing on melting ice caps, we might focus on how recent extreme weather events are affecting local communities. By making climate change feel more immediate, people are more likely to see it as a personal concern. However, this is not always the case. As stated by Van Valkengode et al. 2023, who suggests that psychological distance of climate change is often overestimated. Opinion polls in a 2023 study show that most people perceive climate change as happening now and close by, and that reducing psychological distance does not necessarily increase climate action. Another strategy is to encourage small, achievable climate-friendly actions, such as reducing plastic use or using public transport once a week. This can shift behaviour without triggering strong resistance. Once people engage in small, climate-friendly behaviours, they are less likely to justify an action and more likely to take bigger steps over time. For example, a study on reducing meat consumption by Stoll, Kleeman, and Schmidt 2017 found that framing plant-based diets as a gradual shift, such as meatless Mondays, rather than all-or-nothing thinking, helped people align their behaviours with their environmental beliefs, reducing dissonance. Contrasting this, a systematic review by Weidman et al. 2020 discusses the relationship between wealth and consumption and environmental sustainability. The study suggests that while individual choices matter, real change comes from the top. Governments fuel environmental damage with policies that push economic growth and fossil fuels, while corporations prioritize profit over sustainability. Individual actions help, but they cannot compete with industries driving mass production. Systemic change is key. Finally, reframing climate action to align with social identities can be an influential incentive for change. If we can frame sustainable practices as something that supports the values of a particular group, individuals are more likely to embrace them. For example, conservatives may support climate policies if framed as promoting energy independence. Similarly, linking sustainability to economic resilience can be more appealing to communities that prioritize financial stability. A meta-analysis by Vasily et al. 2021 found that when individuals strongly identify with a group that values pro-environmental behavior, they are significantly more likely to engage in climate-friendly actions. By tapping into the power of social identity, climate advocates can craft messages that are both inclusive and persuasive. In conclusion, while climate change is seen as a major threat, psychological barriers such as psychological distancing, cognitive dissonance, and social identity can hinder our actions. By bringing the issue closer to home, encouraging small, manageable changes, and framing climate action in ways that align with group values, we can overcome these obstacles. Every small action counts, and by rethinking our approach, we can drive meaningful change. Thank you.